Okay, so let's use our validation code to actually perform the validation. So let's go to our schools.go file in our API directory. Okay. So we have our input struct, and right here we're displaying the request. So in between reading the JSON and displaying it, we want to validate it. Okay, so let's go ahead and do our validation here. Okay, so let's initialize a new validator instance. All right, so let's call it V, and we know that validator dot new. Okay, so we have that up here. Okay, validator. Okay, let's come back down. Okay, so once we have our validator, we will now proceed to use it to perform our checks. Okay, so we will use the check method to execute our validation checks. Okay, so this is a bit lengthy, but let's go for it. So I'm going to call check, and remember, check requires a bool, the key, and the message. So how do we get the bool, true or false? Well, I'm going to say input that name. Okay, so this is the first thing we want to validate. I'm going to check to see if it's not the empty string. So this will either return true or false. So if it's false, then we will add that entry to our errors map. So this will give me the bool, okay? And then for the message, the key will be name, and the message will actually be must be provided. All right? So again, we're going to use the check method to do our validation checks. Three things, something that evaluates to a bool, and then the key and the message. Okay, let's check for the length. So assuming that there is something in name, we want to check the length to make sure it's of at least of no more than 200 bytes. So let's check the length of name. All right, and we want to actually, why does it have two lengths? Okay, great. So check the length and check that it's less than or equals to 200 bytes. That's our check, our condition. And so if it turns out to be true or false, sorry, then we know that we need to add a name entry and we need to provide some message. So must not be more than 200 bytes long. Okay, so I think by now you're noticing the pattern. We call check. The first entry needs to evaluate to a bool, and then we pass the key and the message. Let's do the same for level. So I'm just going to copy and paste this to save time. We're going to do level. Okay. And we will change these to level. Okay, so we'll still assume that it must be no more than 200 bytes. So input.level and the length of input.level. Again, we must pass in the key. Okay, so this shouldn't have been changed. Name. Okay, so level. Okay, again, that's a problem in copy and pasting. I always tend to make a mistake. All right, let's deal with the contact. Okay, so contact will be so input that contact. And of course, you're free to speed this up since it's a lot of repetition. So again, we're going to say contact. And we will keep it at 200 bytes. All right, so we're making progress. So after we have the contact, we need to look at the phone. So that one is a bit more interesting. So let's check phone. All right. And so for phone, we want to use our regex to actually ensure that it's a valid phone number. So let's change this to phone. So we will call our matches method. So validator that matches. And so if you recall, matches needs the string and the regular expression. So we know that the string is actually input that phone. Okay, that's the string. And we want to match this up against the phone regex. So validator that phone regex. So our matches method will compare. If it's a valid phone number, it will return true. If not, it will return false. Okay, so that's straightforward. I just need to change the message where if it's false, I will say something like must be a valid phone number. Okay, and of course in the documentation you could specify what the format of that number should be. All right, now let's do the same for email. So I'm going to copy this, paste it. So we're looking at email. Okay. So email must be provided, and we will match our email. So input that email, and we will use the validator that email regex. All right. So email must be a valid email. Okay, so valid email address. All right, so far so good. Let's move on to the website. So let's check the website. If it's empty, okay, so website must be provided, and we will not be using a regex since we're not validating the website using regex. We're simply using the valid website method. So validator dot valid website, and so we're going to pass in input that website, and that will return true or false. So this will be website, and we must say something like must be a valid URL. Okay, making progress. We're almost there. We need to look at address, and then we need to look at the mode. All right, so let me undo that. Let me use this one because we're checking for length. So address and we will make the address be something like 500 bytes. Okay. So must not be more than 500 bytes long. And this, of course, will be input.address, input.address. Okay. So that one was fairly easy. So the last one we want to look at is the mode. Okay. So we want to make sure that there's at least one entry in the mode slice, in the mode field, but no more than 5 entries. Okay. So let's proceed with that. So for a slice, if it's empty, then it's nil. So I will check input that mode and see if it is nil. Okay, nil meaning no entries. Okay, and so if it's nil, then we will have some message like must be provided. Okay, so if there are entries, or if there's at least one entry, then we are good to go. So let's check. Okay, so v.check, and we want to check the length of input.mode. Okay, so if it's greater than or equal to 1, then we are good. If not, then we have a problem. And so we'll have a message such as must contain at least one mode. Okay. Now, let's do the same for the maximum. And so we want to ensure that there is no more than 5 entries. So is it less than or equals to 5? Well, if not, must contain at most 5 modes. Okay. So in fact, let's not call this mode, let's say at least 1 entry. At least 5 entries. Okay. Now, assuming it passes that test, these 2 tests, we have the right entries, we need to verify that none of those entries are duplicates. Okay. And so we're going to call our unique helper function. So I'm going to say validator that unique, and so we'll pass in our input that mode, and if all the entries are unique, then we'll get back true. Otherwise, we'll get back false. And if we do, well, then we need to provide some message such as must not contain duplicate entries. All right. So that's what we have. Now, we're not finished yet. We need to actually perform one final check, and we have to check the map to see if, to determine if there were any validation errors. Okay, so after doing all these checks, we need to now check or call our valid method. So if not v.valid, okay, so meaning that there are entries in the map, then we need to deal with those errors. And all we have to do is to call our failed validation response method, pass in W, pass in R, and simply pass in the errors map. Okay, and of course we need to return, otherwise we will still print W input, which is not what we want. Okay, so return terminates the handler, and assuming everything works out, we will print the request that has been validated. Alright, so let's leave this here. Again, all we did was to do the validation checks using the check method. And again, the validation is rather simple. Most of the work went into actually creating the helper methods that are being used. Alright, so in the next lesson, we're going to test our validation to ensure that the code we wrote actually works. I'll see you in that lesson.